So we're here today with our good friend Mark Degross, who's been riding our 2-Volt Dyno Works Yamaha R9, and this is just going to be a video where we recap sort of Mark's experience riding this bike, because Mark has been around in the racing community now for how many years?
This is my 25th year.
25th year of road racing in some capacity. So to say that you've got a little bit of experience on super sport bikes might be a bit of an understatement.
At the club level, I've got a fair amount.
Compare to the R9, obviously I know, and we've helped you set up your R1 that you raced down in the off season at CVMA and Chuckwalla, but what have you raced in the past that's comparable to the new R9s? Didn't you race an R6 back in the day?
I had an R6, had a CBR 600. I've ridden quite a few 750s.
Gotcha.
Just at track days, not really raced them, but at least ridden them.
Sure.
And had some fun with them and stuff like that. A couple 636s.
Gotcha. So for comparison's sake, because we just got back from PIR, which is Portland International Raceway, for those of you that don't know and aren't familiar with the Northwest tracks up here, your best lap time ever at PIR on an R6 was what?
I think I've never done a 10. I've done an 11 flat, which isn't terribly fast there.
Sure.
But I've always wanted to hit a 10, 999.
Sure.
Never did it. So 11 flat for me was about the best I could ever do.
So 10s is all anybody did all this last weekend to essentially end up on the podium. I think
there was one 9 that Aiden might have done a high 9 or we're real close to that, but they were real low 10s.
Yeah.
I was talking with Andy back in the day. Andy and Devin were doing, I think, low 8s, high 7s when they were really competitive. He feels that on the 600s, I think Chromie's done an 8, but they said that was just after tractors paving. He feels like it's mostly drilled now. Even he can't get close to that.
Got it. Yeah, I was going to say, because I don't think anybody's even able to touch Andy's old lap record, even on the 1000s that he set years ago, because the track conditions just are not the same.
That was his opinion. I was kind of asking him, I said, why do you think it's not there? And he felt it was track conditions.
So if he is doing, at the peak low 8s, and really I don't think that's attainable anymore. Everybody out there was doing 10s, and those are some pretty fast guys out there that were doing 10s. Andy was out there doing 10s. Aiden obviously kind of came out of nowhere and was hauling ass on that crazy R6 he was on. John Gessner, who's just dominating the Super Sport Series locally, was doing 10s. So this thing obviously just wasn't capable of doing 10s. But even with 20 horsepower more than stock from peak to peak, and more than 30 horsepower in the over-rev from everything we've done to this engine, it still just doesn't keep up down a straightaway with built ZX6. I shouldn't say built ZX6. Stock engine ZX6 with like our full exhaust and tuning package on there, or whatever the hell Aiden's riding on that R6.
He smokes everybody, but just a common R6, a common ZX6, I couldn't even stand the draft. It wouldn't pull me super fast, but it was like, wow. Yep.
But that was initially surprising to me because on paper, the engine, with the way it's set up, is pretty much exactly comparable in terms of horsepower to something like a ZX6, which obviously John just would walk away from you on down the straightaway. The big problem with these bikes, which we're actually going to address very, very shortly as soon as some parts show up from Europe, is there's no ram air. From the factory, this opening here is your headlight. And right now, you can see my hand, if you can watch it on the camera in the background there, going all the way through, and there is no functional ram air on the stock airbox on the MT-09, the Tracer 9, the XSR 900, the R9, because they're all the same engine, the same intake. And not having that ram air effect on some of the really long tracks like Portland, which really is just 2 long straightaways with a couple turns in between, seemed like it really hurt you out there when it came to just you sitting there pinned and kind of waiting for something to happen, being stuck in those upper 140 mile an hour ranges.
It was funny talking to guys. They'd see me in the front straight and they'd start going, okay. They knew they'd get I'm a little bit bigger than most, so they'd get behind me, and they knew I wasn't going super fast, so they would come in and shake and bait me, use it for the draft. So
exactly.
They would love it. And I would try and pull back in their draft, and I could feel the bike pick up a little bit of RPMs, but even then they'd still slowly walk away from me. So
even with very aggressive gearing, this is significantly more aggressive than the stock gearing. Stock on this bike, I believe, is 1643, and we are running 1545, so -1 +2, and almost 30 horsepower more at the top end in the over rev with the cam package we have in there, the full Acura, the DNA Stage 2 intake, and our custom tuning. And on the big top end straightaways, it still just doesn't hold a candle to the 600s. Now, I think it's safe to say that in your opinion, that's probably the only downside to this platform.
I would. Yeah, chassis is great. I could do pretty much anything I want to do it, and it's your bike. I don't want to go out and wad a bike up, but I'm a competitive racer, so I'm like trying to balance this fine edge, and it just was egging me on to do things. And we were joking. I stuffed several people in Ford just on lines that were not optimal, but just it's confident. Just throw it in, stick on the brakes, release, and get out. And like, wow, wow, you did it great.
Exactly.
So the chassis is wonderful. Off the corners, it's really good. It just
a lot of torque right off the bat.
It jumps off the corner, and then it just kind of, I wouldn't say falls on its face. It just goes. It just once it gets up and starts pushing above 100, it just doesn't have that force driving through the air.
Unfortunately, the acceleration curves look pretty funny on these bikes. They're a very aggressive ramp, and then they very quickly start to plateau. In the hooligan class, more of the plateau back in the day when we were looking at a lot of that was just from drag. But this doesn't have any drag or aerodynamic issues. The bodywork on this thing is incredibly slippery.
I'm the drag on it.
You might have a little bit of additional drag on the thing, but yeah, you get up into that 140 range, and then the acceleration starts to really slow down as you creep up into the higher 140s. Yeah. Now, we have not tested the thing yet with the ram air intake installed, because like I said, it's not here yet from our friends over in Europe that are getting that for us. I'm hoping that it is in stock, or not in stock, that it's arrived and cleared customs and import duties and whatever tariff I have to pay now. And we can get it on the bike and get it retuned and then get it set up to go out to another track day that you've got at Pacific Raceways next Wednesday. Is that correct?
Wednesday the 18th.
Next Wednesday.
Yep.
So that would be a really great test, and I'm something a lot of people would want to see, because again, on paper, I think people would assume that this bike right now would go hang with a ZX6 or an R6 all day, and it's just not the case.
I think on a short, tighter track that doesn't have big straightaways, it will do well, if not almost have a little edge there.
Right.
Like we're talking, I think we might have an edge at the ridge.
Right.
On some of the other ones, whereas you get these tracks that are fast and flowing like Pacific and PIR, and it doesn't seem to have it. It doesn't have an edge.
Yeah, exactly.
It's given up some there.
Now, for the testing's sake, we couldn't really honestly do the accurate testing we need to do for ram air somewhere like the Ridge, because at the Ridge Motorsports Park, we all run the chicane now, and you just cannot get up to a high enough top speed.
You're 140, I think. Motor America, even 600s are 150 to 155 tops, and motorbikes are 160 to 165. I think.
Yeah, the trap speed record, I believe, on Beaubier's M1000RR is 163.2, I believe. So knowing that, it's a short straightaway with the chicane that they had to install to make the track essentially Moto America compliant, or for what they wanted for the course. So we can't do that testing out there. So we are going to go out to Mark's midweek day at Pacific, where there's a very long straightaway and a very, I can't even call turn one really a turn. It's sort
you're
of a
wide open
for turn one. Exactly.
You're actually, I think we looked at data, that your speed is just past turn one before the braking zone at turn two.
Exactly.
And so you're full on tap as soon as you come out of the bus stop.
Yep. So yeah, we can stay pinned and get some good mile an hour data there at Pacific and there at Portland, but we don't race back at either of those tracks until
I think August. With both of them. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So for our upcoming racing, this is pretty much only going to be at the Riz Motorsports Park. But we need to obviously get the Ram Air kit and see the effectiveness of it installed before we get back out to Portland or Pacific back in August, because we certainly don't want to have a repeat, I don't want to say repeat performance, you still won the race. Yeah, that was a much closer race than I expected. Now, in Colin Carahill's full disclosure and fairness here, that Triumph of his is a lot faster than this R9, and it has Ram
seems to
Air.
have a little edge, yes.
Yeah, exactly. So I was just surprised, because again, on paper, this should not have had the issues that we've encountered, but it does, and the fact that you had to pull some of the passes that you did at the very end to end up with a this close photo finish was surprising. So we certainly don't want to end up back in that scenario again come August. Now, as you were saying at the Ridge, I think this is going to be a totally different story. I think this is where this bike is really going to shine and sort of show people that have bought these and are looking at maybe buying them for future track day bikes for themselves or future race bikes for themselves, that especially at a shorter track, this should be absolutely fantastic to ride.
I'd even say not even shorter tracks, just tracks that don't have long straightaways.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Now, besides the power, again, you've put now way more laps on it than I have. I put just a handful of laps of your last Pacific testing day on it just because I was shocked at the mile an hour that we were seeing on the data and wanted to confirm it for myself, and you bullied me into it.
I did.
Was there really any shortcomings anywhere else on this thing that you felt, or any nitpicks or gripes or anything with the way that it's set up? And just give me your full honest answer, because again, I build and tune the things all day for a living, and I'll go do some laps on them, but I just do not have both the race pace that you do, the expertise that you do, and now not even anywhere near the amount of laps that you do on this thing.
I mean, the big thing, you and I talked about this before, is I'm like, Nate, we're going to put my grandpa seat on. I'm like, I don't think you're going to need it. And shockingly, there's so much room. This bike has, I had a few guys sit on it. Man, this thing is a lot larger than we think. They're thinking R7 size, maybe even an R3, you know, and you get on it, like, it's roomy. There's room all over the place. The front end feels wide with the wings on it. And I have bad knees, is why we joke about this. And so I can't, the seat to foot peg for me is a challenge because my knees are pretty much gone, and so usually I have a 2-inch seat. On this one, we just put a little 1/2-inch one on there. It was great, really roomy front to back, very easy for me to move on it. The chassis, it's just begging me to ride harder, which is where I'm like, okay, we don't need to go all out yet, but I could put the bike wherever I wanted to put it. The brakes are extremely good, so much so that I'm having to soften my initial pull because it grabs so good. It's inviting. That's what it's really confidence inspiring for me. It's asking for more, and I'm just trying to learn the bike and feel for it. And it's every time I do, it's like more confidence coming. So it feels good that way. As a compliment to you is just as you go, you know, turn 4 is a classic one, turn 3 is a classic one. You really have to have a real light initial throttle pickup, and there wasn't this ton of feeding it where now it's kicking in, and it wasn't this sputtering. It was just you can come and start loading that rear tire and get ready to drive, and that was so nice. Knowing that it was going to be consistent, and I could be really precise with the throttle rather than having to get all this. So that was a really good job that you did with that. The tuning was great, and that is a big deal to a rider, because then now I don't have to guess on that and try and manage all those fluctuations that go on in there. So
I'm glad to hear it, because we worked a lot on the throttle-by-wire mapping and the engine braking mapping with the factory back teams that I still can't publicly talk about when I was helping them develop a lot of that tuning. But yeah, we've done a lot of smoothing with the throttle-by-wire mapping and the engine braking mapping. The engine braking was another question I actually had for you. In those heavier braking zones in Portland, did you have any inkling that there was not enough or too much engine braking whatsoever?
I thought it was really close to ideal. I mean, turn 4 is probably, turn 1 and turn 4 are pretty heavy braking zones, and I was having plenty of engine compression and not too much at the same time.
Good.
And yeah, I had no problems with it. It was wonderful.
Yeah, glad to hear it, because again, something we worked on a lot with the teams that we were helping.
And
so
understanding that, working with it when I had the GYTR system on the R1 and how I didn't like how it was set up, and I went in and adjusted it, and when you get it right, it's amazing. It's a big difference. So this was really good.
Good. Yeah, the whole idea with any electronics package on any of these modern bikes is to make it so it's just one less thing you have to think about. So if you never notice it being a problem or being necessarily good or bad, then it's probably perfect. Because if your brain doesn't have to process that extra input, it's just more essentially bandwidth that you can allocate toward everything else on the bike. Well, so other than that, any other comments or thoughts?
I mean, I mentioned this too when I first rode a Pacific, how buttery smooth the transmission is.
Yeah.
That when I first rode a Pacific, I kept looking at, when I was doing my upshifts, downshifts was what I was doing. Upshifts were great. You could definitely feel those in your acceleration. But when you're going on the brakes, getting downshifts, and I couldn't even tell, I couldn't hear it auto blip.
Yep.
I couldn't even feel a click of the lever.
Yep.
And I'd go down 2 or 3 gears and look, and sure as shit, the gear indicator would tell me I made him. And you just have to trust it after a while.
Yep.
At Portland, I finally just got used to, hey, I got him in.
Yeah.
But you don't get that little feedback, and you said that's kind of characteristic of the CP3, is that right?
The transmissions in these are pretty darn smooth. I will say that it's much smoother than our MT-09, which I have a boatload of track days on now. And I was picking up on the same thing that you were saying when I went and test rode the bike at Pacific Raceways as well. And I think a significant difference here between the R9, the way we have it set up now, and the MT-09 that I was riding, and this is really just going to be some free promotion for the guys over at Attack, thank you by the way, it's got to be something with the angle and the geometry of the rear sets, because it is so much smoother actually than the MT-09, which was already very smooth, that I completely agree with what you were saying. When I was going down the front straight, just clicking through gears, and then all of a sudden I'd be start rowing back through them to go into turn 2. I'm like, is it in? Like there was no click, there was no drama, there was no anything. It's just all of a sudden you're in the next gear. So that definitely, I can imagine, takes a bit of a mental shift to get used to, because the R1s are not that way.
No, they're not.
At all.
No, and that's kind of my baseline. Started riding that the last 3 years.
Yeah.
And so it was very smooth. And once you get used to it, you're like, okay.
The other thing that a lot of people were concerned about, I shouldn't say a lot of people, a lot of us were concerned about, that sort of knew what a lot of the teams dealt with in sort of the preseason testing over in Europe, were the clearances for the case covers. Now, those teams, when they went out there for their initial testing, I believe that was at Jerez, I can't share the photos I saw because they're not mine to share, but they were grinding cases into the ground with relatively stock chassis geometry. Obviously, the rear of this bike is picked up dramatically from the way it sat stock, and so is the front. I don't see where you had any rubbing of anything anywhere.
And as most people know with me, I have special toe sliders that are like curb feelers. And so I was just having to reposition my feet.
Yeah.
And I'm used to dragging excessive toe.
Yeah, right.
I have steel toe sliders on them,
Yep.
so that it helps. But the bikes seem to have all kinds of ground clearance.
Good.
Now, I'm not, Jorge Martin style where I'm dragging elbow and shoulder. But
there's no chicken strips
on
the front or the back, so you were certainly leaning it over.
Well, and it felt like what it felt like is I had every leaning I needed to use, and then some.
Good.
And there were, and turn 2 is probably where I'd like to say we had the most lean angle. Maybe I'm wrong. I have to look at data, but you're over leaned over quite a bit, trying to roll through that pretty quick.
Right.
Especially as you're dipping in to hit the apex late in turn 2. That to me is when we're.
Yeah, you're over 55 degrees there.
I would guess something in that ballpark, and I never once felt anything even close. Yeah, so the clearance was great, and I didn't even know that you were saying that these had ground clearance issues because it didn't even feel like it was an issue.
Well, so that was something that Eric Wood and I were talking about at Woodcraft, which is why he sent these over to us. Thank you, by the way, Eric, to go ahead and essentially do the testing for them. Like, hey, they developed each for the MT-09. The case cover is obviously the same for the R9, but are we going to have clearance issues? Yes or no? And in race trim, I can confidently say that clearly not. They didn't get anywhere near the ground. There's not a mark anywhere on the belly pan or either side of the cases or the exhaust anywhere. So once you get the chassis geometry right, the clearance issues that we were all sort of worried about don't seem to be present. Well,
be interesting to see.
The only other thing, I guess, that I would be curious to hear your feedback on was the suspension.
the whole suspension in general I thought was great. Saw the rear tire wear.
Yeah.
It looks freaking flawless.
It
was
doesn't
a hot
really
day.
get better than that.
It was a 0. I know that Joe ran an X on his R6 and his looked about the same. Super hot day. Pittman ran an X.
Yeah,
I had a 0, which I had so much luck with zeros everywhere I've ridden the R1 at. I'm like, just throw a 0 on it. I know what to expect, and it looks phenomenal.
You run a 1 in the front?
1 or 2. Doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
I'll vary the pressure a little bit.
Sure. Yeah. If you go with the 2, you just run a little bit less pressure.
Yes.
Yeah.
So no, the suspension I thought was fantastic, and it was phenomenal. It did everything I wanted to do. I was trying to get the bike to spin up, and I could not get it to spin up.
Good.
Yeah.
So that's actually something else that we can just kind of quickly talk about. As it sits right now in the Woolwich Racing software, which is what we use to manipulate the tuning in the OEM ECUs, unlike the R1, which Mark is familiar with, we do not have control yet over the traction control or the lift or just wheelie control mapping. So I'm very glad to see that even at a legitimate race pace, the electronics didn't seem to be a hindrance anywhere. No. And you and I checked that out actually at Pacific as well, where we did some laps, sent you out there with it on, and then shut it off and just say, go nuts, see what happens. And effectively there was no change. You weren't engaging the TC anywhere, even with the 70-some pound-feet of torque this thing makes, because the chassis is just so freaking stable. So I'm glad to hear that even with it turned on, at race pace, it wasn't any sort of interference for you, because that means for everybody else going out to do track days, you don't have to worry about it. There's a lot more mental confidence in the back of your head when you're riding, knowing that you have electronics behind you just to help prevent essentially high sides is really what we're all trying to save ourselves from. And that you can leave them on these bikes and do the pace you were doing is fantastic, because again, at the time, or as of right now, we don't have any ability to change them. Now in the future, with the Superbike engine, which we'll talk about here in just a second, we may need to play with the electronics, because I know that they were shutting them off with some of the teams in the Hooligan series just so they didn't run into TC issues. But those bikes are making 20 horsepower more than we do right now. So to combat your one frustration with this package, which seems to be just the top end, we've got some solutions above and beyond just the Ram Air kit. The Ram Air kit, as it sits right now from GYTR and what they're using on the Moto American and World Supersport bikes, is sadly unobtainium. You're not going to be able to get one this season. I had to pull a lot of strings to be able to get even just the Ram Air tube, let alone the fairing stay, to make it work.
Which is half the battle, huh?
Exactly, yeah, because you cannot just drop the tube in here. There's so much structure.
Well, the stock fairing stay won't work because it's not designed for it to be there in the first place.
Exactly, yeah. So, unfortunately for most people this season, for 2025, riding these things, the Ram Air kit isn't going to be available. What will be available is quite a bit of head work. Now, these engines stock are like 11 to 1 compression. They're super low, and they really like squish. So I can tell you from relatively mild improvements to compression and some very basic port and polish work, which we'll show when we get our head over from the teams that we're working with, the power goes through the roof. Now, they do also make a set of kit pistons for these bikes, which I'm not sure we're gonna need yet. We'll try just the headwork first, but I know that when you do the exact same headwork we're going to be doing with the exact same cams and the kit pistons on Moto America spec fuel, which is only a couple horsepower more than pump gas, you're running about 143, 144 horsepower to the tire, which is 18 or 19 horsepower more.
This is what, 125?
125
now? Yep.
Yeah. So 18 or 19 horsepower more as it sits just at the moment without Ram Air. So that is something that I don't think we're going to be able to potentially get done before the race at the Ridge. However, the next round, we should have it ready to go, because I think the head's going to be here in just a couple weeks. I'll be very curious to see, and we'll kind of mix and match and go back and forth so people can see the difference of the Ram Air kit with the engine just as it sits right now, because really this is just a stock engine with Giacchetto's drop-in cams and intake exhaust and tuning. It's a very achievable package for most people. And then we'll take the Ram Air kit back off and put the stock airbox with DNA lid back on it. This is how it is right now with the Superbike head. Because even without Ram Air, and I'm guessing without the pistons, with just effectively a drop-in head and cams, it should be still about 140 horsepower. With the Ram Air and with the Superbike head kit, I think then we'll have some magic happening where we could potentially get into the mid to upper 140s to the tire, plus the hard to measure Ram Air effect at 140 plus mile an hour. And then I think you'll have a really fun bike to ride at Pacific.
I think it'll be an improvement. I know one of the things we asked about before, velocity stacks. Are they given variable?
Yes.
Does this have variable velocity stacks?
It does not.
And do we have the ability to get different height velocity stacks?
We do.
Okay, so that's another key thing when the people play with this stuff. At high end, it makes a big difference what your length of velocity stack is.
Yeah, thank you for reminding me. So the OEM velocity stacks on the 4th generation CP3 airboxes are pretty tall. They're made for mid-range torque. These these engines really came from like the MT-09s and the XSR 900s, and they just threw them into the R9 because it's the engine package that they wanted to put for Supersport. Those bikes are built for mid-range torque. They're not top-end Supersport bikes. So I do know, I won't throw them under the bus. I don't know if it's a design they're going to settle on yet. There are some rather large companies that have built velocity stacks for these engines that are significantly shorter that we will be getting for testing as well. I will show the testing results, but again, I won't name names until I confirm that that's actually the design they're going to settle on, just because I don't want to show a product that they might not be able to actually sell somebody. But they are significantly shorter. So that will, in theory, flatten the mid-range a little bit, which you already have in excess.
We have plenty of mid-range.
Yeah, but it should increase further the top end on these things.
Yeah.
Now, the other sort of kind of gotcha with these engines is that right now we're actually running these at a higher RPM than they do at Moto America.
Really?
Yeah. So I sent you out
We
there.
got something on Josh, what we're saying. Huh?
Totally. Yeah, Josh Hayes, if you see this, Mark's coming for you. At Moto America, they capped them for class balancing at 11,500 RPM. At World Supersport, they give them 11,800 RPM. Don't ask me why Teague decided to do something different than the class balancing at World Supersport. I don't know. But either way, 300 RPMs is not enormous. We sent you out here with this thing at about 11,700. I've run these with some of the teams out to about 12,000 RPM and not had any issues. So it's going to be interesting with the headwork, the velocity stacks, and the Ram Air kit, because we could conceivably hit a point where all of a sudden we're hitting peak power at the limiter at 12,000 RPM, and then we've got to go backwards, because you don't want to have peak power literally at the limiter. You need a little bit of a plateau out there to work with. And nobody's really pushed these further than 12,000 RPM yet. We have multiple engines, so we could potentially figure that out the hard way. But looking at the
Mechanic's complaining in the background.
Derek's just crying in the corner right now. But we do have multiple engines. We could figure it out the hard way, but looking at the piston speed math, we're actually already exceeding the piston speed of the R6s.
That's not good, yeah.
So
R6 is we're exceeding it, huh?
yes. Wow. The R6 is at 16,000 RPM. I'd have to pull up ChatGPT. It did the math for me the other day when I was looking at it. We're about 2 feet per second faster the way this is set up right now than the R6s are in Moto America spec at 16,000, whatever that is RPM.
That matters.
It does, yeah. And that is a big part of the reason why they also ran with the kit pistons as well. The kit pistons are significantly lighter than the OEM pistons, so it's less mass to move at that speed. I think it's going to be very fun to go back out to Portland and Pacific
Later in the year.
To see the mile an hour differences, because this could be really overly optimistic. You were seeing pushing your own air effectively like 149 at the most.
Oh, 47 to 48.
Yeah, I thought I saw.
If I had a tailwind, maybe.
Yeah, sure. So call it a 48.
Yeah.
I bet. Actually, I don't bet. I know that with the engine work and the Ram Air, there's at least another 10 miles an hour there. Because without the Ram Air on the hooligan bikes, they're already doing 10 miles an hour more than that.
Impressive.
So, and again, that's in a little bit of a draft, but they should be at least another 10 there. Other than that, I think that about wraps up everything that we've got planned coming up for this bike on your side. On the retail side of things, all that's going to be in what I'm calling our Superbike engine, our second engine essentially. We've got exhaust testing that we're going to do. There's a full aero exhaust for this bike that's out now. I saw an email that I'm not sure I should have seen literally this morning. Yoshimura has multiple exhaust systems they're testing, including a full tie setup that they might release to the public. There's a spark exhaust system that's still kind of already made and the teams in Europe are using, but hasn't made it over the States yet. I've had one of those on order for like 2 months now. So we'll be doing lots of that testing on our stock engine, just so like, what I call our retail level customers can see the performance differences there. But I don't think we're going to find more than like 1 extra horsepower from one exhaust to another.
I saw the two with the M4 and this one, and
they're this close, and the Acura only beats it in one tiny little
area
spot. Yeah, because
lower
it
mid
has
range. I
crossover
read that
tubes.
right. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So I don't think we're going to find anything there, but that's probably about where we're going to leave the engine development for the Superbike engine for this season. Because I think if we send you out there with a bike making low to mid 140s to the tire with this chassis, then all of a sudden this bike is amazing.
I think it should be.
Well, thanks for your time for coming over here. I know you did make a bit of a drive to come over here this morning.
You guys are trusting me with your bike, which
Yeah.
some would say might not be the best choice.
You don't crash that often.
Not anymore. Not anymore.
Yeah.
We got rid of that.
Exactly. But no, I'm definitely excited to see what you can do with this thing. Even with the way that it sits just right now, even if the Ram Air Kit doesn't show up in time at the Ridge, I think you're going to have an absolute blast with this. Yeah. Awesome. We'll wrap it up there.
Good stuff, man. All right.
Thanks, buddy.